welcome to the second episode of TrustCast. I'm Alessandra and I'm here with my colleague Jort van Sisseren, CCO at Securance, and Michael La Grouw, Information Security Officer at Nebul. The sound I'm saying it correctly.
Yes.
Welcome and thank you for being here. Would you like to introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So I'm the Information Security Officer at Nebul, as you said. I have about, I'd say, 10 years of experience in the cybersecurity risk sphere, if you will. And before that, was more focused on the technology side of things. I have a background as an architect, so security architect, and I'm now leading the security and compliance within Nebul as a whole. And then Nebul itself is a European scale-up that offers AI and neo-cloud services.
Okay.
With basically providing a European sovereign alternative for the large hyperscalers out there. So think Microsoft, AWS, Google, those providers. So I'm currently growing rapidly and watching the landscape change around us at the moment. Yeah.
Okay. I have a couple of questions. Of course, you can decide if both want to answer the same questions or if only one of you want to answer. We were talking before the podcast started about like regional, like the importance of this shift that we're seeing about regional providers. So we see many organizations reassess who they depend on for cloud, for cybersecurity, for assurance. Are you seeing this shift, and why do you think this shift is happening, if it's happening?
I think we're starting to see the shift, depending on the market, I should add as well. So what we're personally seeing in the market is that we see that Europe as a whole, top-down, is basically starting to move and realize their dependencies on these large hyperscalers that are typically not European-based, right? We've got most of them being US-based, with a couple of them being from China and Asia, whereas Europe is has no real alternative at the moment, and we're starting to see that realization, at least at the European Commission level. They've recently released a framework for sovereignty, which has 8 different points that an organization can use to assess themselves in terms of how sovereign they are operating within Europe's boundaries, if you will, right? How dependent are you from, say, an American party or a Chinese party versus European parties? So we're starting to see that shift in the market from a legislative point of view, I would say. But the business has to follow, right? And that's where we're still seeing, we're seeing people wake up. They're starting to wake up. They're starting to question. But we think that there needs to be more movement in that area, right?
But would you say it's out of comfort as well? Because a lot of companies are set up in a certain way, and before they make the decision to switch to something different, that has operational implications, obviously. And, given the current geopolitical development, I mean, everything goes so quickly, and it's almost hard to believe that we can't rely on, things that we were solidly relying on in the past.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's a combination of both comfort and inherent lock-in over time, right? These decisions have probably been made like 10, 15, maybe even longer ago, where they, start to build on a certain platform, a certain provider, and build out from there. And then, 10 years down the line, your whole ecosystem is dependent on this one vendor staying both up in the air, right? I mean, it's an operational risk as well as staying compliant with European law and regulation. Yeah. And that's definitely something that takes quite a bit of a push, right? If you're completely settled into that ecosystem, you need a certain push to start to move out, right?
Well, I think, we see that with our IT risk assurance clients across the board, basically, is that everybody's reviewing, who are their vendors, where are they based, in which legal framework do they operate. And we have quite a lot of customers at the moment seriously contemplating to switch to European providers. But at the same time, because you're so embedded in systems that have been, set up for years already, and there's legacy on there, before you make that switch, I mean, that is a huge implication. I mean, if you look at, that's why I find this conversation very interesting, because Nebul is providing a real alternative to AWS, to Microsoft, and I think it's quite rare in Europe to do that. So I find, you're a very fascinating provider in that sense. But I mean, if I would put myself in a position of one of our clients that is looking to make that move, where do you start? Because it's I can see it's completely different per company, what they do and how large the organization is. But in general, like, could you tell me a little bit about where you would go to? Like, where do I begin?
Well, one thing I suppose, like you already said, it's very dependent on what kind of organization you are, whether you're, for example, in the tech space, or whether you're, for example, within healthcare, or government, whatever it may be, right? So it depends very much on whether, I suppose, whether it's your core business is the key differentiator there. But typically where it starts is base infrastructure and identity, those two, right? So what we see across the board is identity has always been a key pillar in connecting all of your other services and infrastructure, right? So that's something that is key in as a starting point to see, okay, where does my identity live? And with identity, of course, we mean the technical identity, not necessarily your passport.
Of course, yeah.
Where do your user accounts live, right? Often the case, I would venture to say that in 90% of the case, that's going to be somewhere in the US right now. Right, and then it's a question of interoperability, right? So, how well do certain systems work together? How can you couple them together, right? So, probably a good place to start would be, your baseline infrastructure. Where do I host my containers, for example? Right? Where do I host my compute, my storage, etc. And what we see some companies doing is a multi-cloud strategy where they try to spread their risk across multiple hyperscalers.
But as backups, or just certain compartments?
So not necessarily as backups, but what you'll see is they typically have the same workload running on multiple hyperscalers, and then just dividing traffic or load balancing as necessary, basically. You do also have the backup scenario that does happen, but is typically less realistic due to, in real life scenarios, those backups usually don't get tested all that often, and then when you need it, it turns out that it doesn't really work the way you were expecting it to. We do see some organizations adopting a multi-cloud strategy, but that is while that is spreading your risk from an operational perspective, it's kind of missing the bigger point, which is those hyperscalers all live outside of Europe. Mm-hmm. So you're still having to deal with a discrepancy in predominantly law and regulation where, for example, certain laws are not quite as compatible with GDPR to give an example to start with, right? So if you take...
But US laws or European?
Well, if you take, for example, the US, right, let's take them as an example. They're one of the biggest players, right? So if you take the Cloud Act in the US, that specifically states and allows them to investigate and gather data regardless of where that data is hosted geographically. So while, a lot of these hyperscalers would say, okay, all your data stays within European boundaries, the Cloud Act actually enables U.S. law enforcement to still gain access to that data, regardless of where it's stored, as long as it's an American entity that owns the service, right?
Right, but when you look at that from like your own position as a CISO, like if your data is there, I mean, what are the practical implications of that from a legal standpoint? Like I can imagine a few, but it would be interesting to just name them.
Well, I mean, to start with, let's just call out the fact that this is in direct conflict with GDPR, right? So if you look at the European laws and regulation, GDPR and Cloud Act don't mix, right? So that's, as a starting point, that's where you're already unable to kind of comply with European law, technically, if you're using a US cloud service. On top of that, there is also no way of knowing whether or not that data has been breached, yes or no, or
from
requested.
A practical point of view.
From a practical point of view, exactly. Right? So you're in this situation where, while on paper you get some guarantees, maybe, you cannot, there's no way to verify, right? So we're just basically operating purely on trust. And then if you take into account the current geopolitical climate and how much that is changing over time.
And trust falls away.
Exactly. And then you're left with basically empty promises, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. So, but going back to the legal framework, like, we're obviously talking about cybersecurity acts such as NIS2 and DORA for the financial market and insurance companies. I mean, how do those relate and connect to this subject?
So if you look at, let's take NIS2 for example, right? So NIS2 is actually going to start, hopefully, pushing these companies into reevaluating their dependency on these big non-European hyperscalers, as it will start to basically place some personal responsibility upon the board of those organizations when it comes to guaranteeing business continuity, essentially, which, while not necessarily strictly related to the data subject that we were just talking about, does mean that you have to reevaluate your entire supply chain, right? All of your dependencies. If all your infrastructure is hosted in a single location with a single vendor, how can you possibly guarantee business continuity, right? Like, they could turn off your stuff tomorrow, and you have no viable alternative. You'd have to start from scratch, right?
Right. But, I mean, you often hear the phrase that Europe is over-regulated, GDPR and NIS2, DORA and all these things. And I think, from a operational point of view, that is a valid point, touching on investments and taxes and how hard that is, actually. I mean, that's a valid point. But when it comes to mitigating risk and IT risk in particular, do you feel that we are over-regulating or is Europe making sense in that regard? Sorry to put you on the spot.
No. I think it's a fair call out, right? I think in terms of mitigating risk, it's a pro, right? It's good. It gives clear guidelines on what can and cannot be done. It gives some guidance when you look at the for example, the sovereign framework from the European Commission. They give some clear guidelines on what you should be doing in best case scenario. But then again, if I may look at it from the other side a little bit as part of a scale up that is trying to innovate and bring AI into Europe as an AI provider, that those regulations can sometimes be restrictive, right? So from our perspective, it is great in terms of pushing for sovereignty, pushing for data privacy, all these pillars, right?
Yeah. Control.
Exactly, but from a startup scale-up perspective, it can sometimes be can sometimes be a little bit of friction there.
No, of course, and I can see that, but at the same time, you don't want your data, like you just gave the example of the Cloud Act in the US.
Cloud Act,
yeah,
yes.
the Cloud Act in the US. I mean, if your data is somewhere and you can't control it, and there's no regulation kind of putting up the guardrails, then all bets are off, really. So there's a fine balance between regulation and protection in a sense.
Absolutely. And then what we're starting to see now is really that shift into, okay, now we have all these regulations, because GDPR is not new, right? GDPR has been around for a while now.
Right.
Everyone knows we need to comply with GDPR. But meanwhile, the Cloud Act is, to keep with that example, is essentially not enabling you or blocking you from complying with GDPR.
Yeah.
And what we're seeing now is we're starting to see a slow shift into, okay, now these regulations have been in place for a while, and now we're actually going to enforce some of these. We're going to actually check whether or not companies are, doing their due diligence, if you will, right? The AP, the Autoriteit Persoonsgegevens, is currently starting to look into companies and how they handle data, and I suspect in the near future we'll see some examples coming by of companies who might receive some fines on how they are handling this data.
Yeah, and when you bring it back to Nebul,
like
you provide a service that is operating within a European framework.
Mm-hmm.
So you can basically say, okay, we're providing the same thing of what you need, but then in a compliance European framework. And but who's to say that you don't pull the switch, basically, and then it's within a legal framework, but it's still, you're down, basically. So how do you give security there?
I mean, so that's the difference between operational risk versus, regulatory risk, if you will, right?
Yeah.
I mean, from a Nebul perspective, right, we offer services. We try to keep them as compatible with existing open standards as possible, which means that we try to enable our customers to be able to easily switch onto us, but unfortunately that also means easily switching off us if they would like to, which would enable them to spread that risk and go with multiple different providers, if they exist, which is, I think, currently a bit of where we're missing some European initiative. There's not that many, especially in the AI sphere, there's not that many European-based providers.
Right.
You can get some cloud providers that can give you, a nice baseline. You can get some infrastructure up and running.
Mm-hmm.
That is to say, nothing really comparable with the big hyperscalers. That includes us, right? We are still growing and still maturing our services.
Right.
But I think where our strength lies is that we are fully European sovereign, but not only that, we can serve our customers more on a more personal level, right? So certain features that they might be missing or might need, or perhaps even some hand holding, if you will, right? We can provide that service to a degree that a big hyperscaler just simply does not and will not, right? They are all set to scale, whereas we are still in that growing phase.
And when you look at, you were saying there's not a lot of European providers that do this in at the scale and level that you guys do. Is that touching on the investment environment in Europe as well? Is that a limitation, or is there also a regulatory limitation that it's hard to set this up and scale this? Because you would expect, given circumstances, that Europe would open the floodgates to initiatives like Nebul.
You would expect so, yes.
But how do you? What's your experience of that?
So what we see now is that we're simply a little behind in Europe. So I don't know, maybe you've read about this as well. There's currently a European initiative to start building an AI data center basically in Europe, which is set to be finished, I believe, somewhere 2028. Meanwhile, you know, all the other territories, if you will, are growing at exponential rates, and we are talking about putting down our first data center, while we as Nebul already have that AI factory, if you will, up and running, right? So rather than investing in existing initiatives and boosting existing initiatives, we're seeing Europe trying to, you know, do their own thing outside of what is already there. So that's where, you know, we see missed opportunity really from our perspective.
Right. And are there initiatives to kind of like, you know, consolidate that effort in a sense that, you know, comparable companies like Nebul or maybe even governments on a local level are more trying to push this into like one direction? Or is there any initiative in that sense?
Not really. Not that I can tell. We can see, like I was saying, we can see top down. There's some movement coming, but at the same time, we see governments, municipalities, picking the same old, you know, big, large hyperscalers that they already do business with, rather than, you know, diversifying their portfolio a little bit, right?
But would you say, like, I would expect right now we're kind of on a tipping point for that, because people are becoming more aware, and that's what we see with you know, at Securance with our clients.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when they are like when like we were in like initial conversation about, you know, IT risk assurance. You know, you want your SOC 2 or your ISA 3402 or your BSI C5 in Germany, or, you know, all of those frameworks. You know, that you're basically talking about controls that you have in place. You know, the sample sizes go up the more you grow, so the more data you provide us with. So I get more and more questions about where does the data go to, you know, and when they're selecting, for instance, an auditor you know, that's our perspective. We see that, you know, being the European market leader for IT risk assurance really gives us a position where we are being selected over, let's say, American or Indian providers who might be cheaper, but, you know, people want their data within Europe, within this legal framework. Is that something you encounter as well with clients?
Yes.
I mean, it's a bit of an obvious question.
Because otherwise they probably wouldn't be talking to us, right? So, but...
No, but maybe let's rephrase it. Like, obviously you're getting that question because that's the bottom line. But what I'm interested in is there a massive uptick in those questions?
There is an uptick in the questions. There is slightly less of an uptick in actual action. Exactly, right? So, and what we're seeing with clients is when it's easy, they'll pick the European alternative or the safe alternative. Mm-hmm. But when either implementation, purchase, or whatever it may be is as a higher threshold, I would say, that conversation suddenly becomes a lot less relevant, and then it's like, okay, let's go with the, you know, the known solution, the provider that we already have a contract in place with, like. And part of the reason for that, I think, personally, is because there's no consequences. Yet. Right?
But it's willingly accepting the risk.
Yes.
And it seems that risk is growing on a daily basis. So, I mean, you would expect that the situation kind of forces people's hands, right?
That's what you would expect, yes. We obviously carefully monitor the news as well. And I'm sure you've probably read this as well. A couple of months ago, some mailbox at the ICC was turned off, for example. Right? These kind of small little drops in the bucket. We expect at some point that this bucket will overflow and that people will start to realize, okay, we really have to, you know, jump into action now. The big question for us is, whether that will be in time or whether it will be too late.
But yeah, no, exactly. But I mean, who will initiate that? Do you what do you expect? Will that be governments or will that be companies?
I expect that for the average company to take action would require significant regulatory penalties, if you will, because they don't have any other real drive or motivation to diversify other than operational. But they've already accepted the operational risk, right? That's why they are where they are, right? So I would expect sectors with sensitive data to start moving first. So that probably means governmental, healthcare, these kind of organizations to start moving towards European alternatives sooner rather than later.
But is that also that's something you are seeing already, or that's an expectation?
Well, I would say it's probably not a coincidence that most of our customer discussions are around biotech, healthcare, and governmental customers. We do see the occasional, regular commercial business popping up, but these are just there's much less awareness with your average day-to-day organization when it comes to, okay, how sensitive is my data? Where is it stored? Does it actually comply with all of the laws and regulations, especially since there's very little consequences up till now, at least.
Yeah.
Whereas, organizations that are used to dealing with sensitive data are much more sensitive to the topic.
Right. Yeah, but I can also imagine, for me personally, just before we started, we talked about that. I used everything Google has to offer, so the entire G Suite basically, so Calendar, Gmail, Drive, all of that. I moved everything to Pronto, a European alternative, and it's actually, without making, I'm not selling it, I don't have shares, but it works in the same way. But that was driven by the fact that I thought, if there is a risk of, certain levers being used, and I can't access my data, that would be, inconvenient to say the least. So I thought, it's a small effort to do that, and that's on a personal level. So I can imagine that, a lot of individuals are starting to think along these lines. They read the news, they see what's happening, and as that's being, when that's something that's happening, those people work within companies, so they bring up the same subjects within the company as well. I feel it's kind of like I wouldn't call it a movement, but I mean, it's something that is growing, I would expect.
I would say it's like bubbling under the surface, right?
Yeah.
It's there. Everyone knows we should be doing it differently. Everyone knows it's not quite right the way we're doing it now.
Yeah.
But it just needs to get through that threshold to actually jump into action. And I think we'll start seeing more of that once NIS2 really lands. And
Q2.
boards, and boards can be held responsible for personally responsible for their practices, essentially, right?
Yeah. No, exactly. But there's obviously there's something is maybe too big for them to pin on them personally when it's, for instance, AWS that is all of a sudden down.
Mm-hmm.
But then still, given the circumstances and developments, I can imagine that there will be a point that you say, yeah, but you should take care of a backup there, or at least an alternative that allows you to continue operations.
Well, exactly, right?
Yeah.
AWS being down does not necessarily mean that your entire infrastructure has to be down, right?
No, exactly. That's a choice.
Yeah, that's a choice. That's a definite choice. And, like I was saying earlier, there are some organizations adopting a multi-cloud approach, but there's, a lot of discussion whether that's the right way forward as well, right?
Yeah.
I think from an operational risk perspective and from an NIS2 perspective, having everything with one hyperscaler is not going to be enough anymore. And the problem is that it's not just, I have a few servers that are running in AWS. I have my identity in AWS. I have my storage in AWS. My databases in AWS. I have my compute in AWS. My financial administration. I may have a tool for that. It's a SaaS that I purchase.
Yeah.
That then also runs on AWS. Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So then you get this entire dependency chain where it's a matter of time. We already see outages that affect the entire internet, right? I think a couple of weeks ago we had a big one where I think it was Cloudflare, I believe, that went down, and you see like half the internet disappear.
Yeah. No, and I mean, again, from an IT risk perspective, from an assurance perspective, like, let's stay with AWS. They would have a SOC 1 and a SOC 2.
Mm-hmm.
But if from a geopolitical standpoint, they pull the switch, then that is basically just paper, and that's the real point. It has to be embedded in. Yes, you got all these controls, great, and you're living it because you're audited, great. But then you still need to embed it in a trustworthy legal framework. And I think that's why the European aspect matters so much. Excuse me. And I think is grossly underestimated, because the rule of law is effectively what allows for trust to function. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. No, interesting.
So I was actually, because we were talking about this before we started, so it's established now, so there are no questions more needed, that geopolitical environment and changes and shifts are more and more important for companies. Do you think that jurisdictional alignment, so the fact that you're operating within the same framework, a legal system, it matters now more than price, for example, or ability, capability? And if not, should it matter more?
I think it should probably, but I don't think it does right now.
Okay.
If you go back 10, 15 years ago, there was much more alignment, between, for example, the US and Europe when it came to law and regulation. We're seeing that shift now, and we're seeing more discrepancy between the two. Which means that inherently the value of, jurisdiction should go up when evaluating a certain vendor, a certain service, whatever it may be. And I think that is currently not happening to the degree that it should.
Okay.
I think capability is probably the main one that is currently being evaluated.
Okay.
Because what people maybe not even take into account as much is by locking yourself into these hyperscalers, you also lock yourself into future price increases, right?
Yeah, it's vendor lock-in.
It's classic vendor lock-in,
classic,
right?
yeah.
And perhaps even more than, if you would say a vendor lock-in 15 years ago, that would mean, okay, you have a certain software running on your own servers in your data center somewhere,
right.
Okay? And if you had to switch, that might mean a migration of some sort for that particular piece of software. Whereas now when you say vendor lock-in, you're essentially saying, we buy all of our infrastructure in one place, right? With one vendor, whether that be an AWS, a Google, a Microsoft, you name it, right? So price, while of course always a factor in decision making, is actually not being fully taken into account.
Okay.
Because once you make that decision, if 5 years from now or 2 years later down the line, that price goes up, you no longer have the option of going with the alternative, essentially. So what you're seeing is people are looking at capability, taking the price for what it is, and they're not really looking too much, into jurisdictions. And
But they should. Your advice is that they should.
They should definitely start taking that into account.
I can also imagine that, when you're talking about capability, that because these companies are so big and well known, that it's also a matter of people simply not knowing about European alternatives and what their capability is. Are they actually seeing them as a reasonable alternative from an operational point of view?
I think rarely. I mean, there are some European alternatives, of course, us included, but I think most of the conversation is around which of the big three are we going to pick, right? Which one offers the best capabilities and for the best price, rather than actually looking into the market, looking at European alternatives.
Yeah.
And part of this is because of the very successful marketing campaign, I would say, from these hyperscalers, where they say, okay, your data is in Dublin or it's in Amsterdam, and it won't go onto any US-based servers. Whereas,
but the Cloud Act basically doesn't care about geography. It's controlled by the US.
Exactly. So that's
Frankfurt or Dublin, those are just names basically.
That's what it comes down to. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
And of course, we did have a period prior to the Cloud Act. I think the Cloud Act started in 2018, I believe, from the top of my head, where, that may have been a valid conversation, where, US law enforcement could not reach that data necessarily. But, it's we're in 2026 now. Yeah. It's been a couple of years, and, that argument doesn't fly anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And does this topic come up in conversation with clients and prospects?
Yeah, absolutely. But of course, if we are talking to a client or a prospect, they are already, in that mindset typically.
Okay, sure.
Right? But, we still see that the awareness is not fully there. So they're talking to us from, for example, a data privacy perspective. Like, hey, right. I don't want any of my data to be used to train AI models. That's a typical conversation we might have, which is okay. Yeah, sure. We can guarantee that we don't use your data for training purposes, right? But there's no real discussion about law or regulatory consequences, essentially. And GDPR sometimes comes into play, especially when we're talking about, ingesting a lot of data for the purpose of, training an AI or hosting a lot of data. But we see that discussion more around our AI side of the business, where it's about, training on data and personal identifiable information, that sort of stuff.
Right.
Okay. Whereas I think for the average cloud discussion, if you will, people have already kind of accepted it is what it is.
Right.
The standard phrase, right? There's no real viable alternative with the same capabilities as these big 3 or big 4 hyperscalers. Whereas I don't think that's true. I think there's plenty of European alternatives that can offer the same capabilities compared to these hyperscalers.
Well, and in order to be compliant with GDPR, it sounds like you don't really have a choice. And I think, with NIS2, being active already in a few countries such as Belgium, the Netherlands following suit in Q2, I can imagine you get more and more questions regarding NIS2 as well.
We're seeing an uptick, yeah, for sure. And we're hoping that trend keeps on going, right?
No, of course, yeah.
But it all depends on external motivations, really, because the average organization is, they're managing their risk, right? And if there's no consequences to the choices that they make, then why would they go for a different alternative than that they're currently settled on? Right?
Well, but yeah, like you said earlier, like NIS2 will give you personal liability. I mean, if that doesn't change your mind, I mean, what will?
Yeah,
and of course it's a discussion about how great is the risk and the likelihood of that coming to fruition. That's obviously, you know, what's the price of failure, and how likely is it that it will happen? That's always something that is a debate, like internally. But then still, you know, with the geopolitical situation, with the regulatory development, with the legal framework on top of that, I mean, you would expect people to become like more aware and start to act, right? I'm surprised that that's not happening faster.
So are we.
Yeah, no, it's like, you know, it's obviously because you're in the business of mitigating risk that you look at that in a different light. But I'm actually floored because, you know, I listen to like Boekestein in de Wijk and those guys, like those podcasts. I mean, I think it's brilliant.
Yeah.
But you know, that's maybe a good example. A lot of people listen to that podcast, and if you don't, then I really it's a good tip. But you know, what these guys are talking about and what's basically happening day by day, you would expect this to become more urgent. So I am honestly, you know, biased, but at the same time, I'm surprised as well.
Yeah, but I think obviously the conversations that you're having with your clients are already around risks, right? So you're already talking to the people who care, essentially, right? Unfortunately, that's not always the final decision maker, right? And I think, like, to go back to what I said earlier, I think it is bubbling just under the surface. I think we just need a push in the right direction, and I think it needs to come from two things. One is, you know, actual consequences. So hopefully NIS2 will help a little bit there, and maybe the AP can dish out a few fines here and there to wake people up. And on the other side, I think there needs to be probably more stimulus from Europe for, you know, European sovereign tech companies, essentially, right? That can offer viable alternatives to these hyperscalers. Because if I look at it from a bit of a broader perspective, you know, we're focusing really on AI, cloud infrastructure, that sort of stuff. But if you look at it much broader, almost all modern software, SaaS services, you name it, is coming from the US or China, I suppose.
Yeah.
Take the apps that you use on a day-to-day basis. How many of those are European?
No, of course. I mean, you have the note takers, for instance. There are European alternatives, but I think, you know, it's partly marketing, I think, and just how well known solutions are. But I mean, we are already very aware of you know, picking tools that are European, and also because we want to keep our data in Europe and all of that. Like, it's definitely something that we're looking at. Yeah. But it is, you know, at the same time, it's very hard because, you know, you buy your computer, your laptops with Windows, and it all runs on Microsoft, and it's kind of hard to get around. So you really have to make an effort. So I think the risk is predominantly operational and practical, that you just make different choices because, like you say, it's easy. I totally get it, but you know, it starts to become more of an issue. You know, you really have to think about the consequences of this. So, the willingness to endure a little bit of pain, in a sense, should maybe increase.
I think if we want to stay relevant as Europe, we have no choice.
Yeah, I agree.
We're already, you know, being left behind in the dust.
Okay.
Right and center, essentially. Mm-hmm. If you look at the amount of AI data centers being built, for example, I think it's almost non-existent in Europe in comparison to what the US and China are doing. Yeah. If you look at cloud alternatives, European cloud alternatives, we're basically quite a few years behind compared to the big hyperscalers. Mm-hmm. If we don't start, you know, focusing on viable European alternatives and actually cultivating that culture and supporting those businesses that are trying to provide those alternatives, and then I think it's going to be a losing race, essentially.
Right. So for Nebul to scale up faster, what do you need? I mean, you're giving the answer, but it's like for you specifically, what would you need to really go pedal to the metal?
Customers.
No, but of course, but I mean, it's part of it is being known, so people know that there's an alternative.
Yeah.
But another part is perhaps some like a push from government on both a European and national level that this is serious and this is something that they need. Like, I mean, could you subsidize this or something like that? I don't know. I mean,
I think you're right on the mark. Right? One is awareness. In general, the public needs a bit more awareness on this topic. But the second one is, I would expect, at a minimum, for there to be some sort of directive that governments themselves, municipalities, governmental institutions, should be required to buy and use European.
Yeah.
Whether that be,
That's good.
IT infrastructure, whether that be, the cars that they use, whatever it may be, right? I think that should be step one, essentially.
Right. Okay. Have no fear, buy European gear.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
We have the slogan already.
Yeah. I mean, no, but it was something from, I think, during the 60s or 70s. You had Help elkaar, koop Hollandse waar.
Ah,
That was the Dutch. That was the Dutch alternative.
That's
so.
before my time.
before our time.
Mine as well.
Yeah, I think all our
No, of course, but it should be something that's on our mind. Like you want to buy European cars because it's better from every angle, and this is the same.
And that you don't want to over-regulate the commercial market, that's fine, right? But at least if, from a European Commission standpoint, you are trying to encourage buying sovereign, buying European, etc., then at least, put action to those words and say, hey, guys, from this day forward, whenever you do a vendor review, you have to include European alternatives, and if you don't go with the European, you need to prove that there's no viable European alternative.
Yeah, which makes sense, and but predominantly from a risk perspective. I think more so right now. I mean, all the other points you made are absolutely valid, but from a risk perspective, like, we cannot be dependent on other countries, basically.
No.
And unless there's like treaties and everything that is like more protective in that sense. But we had the same with the US. So where that is heading, I mean, they are basically not respecting the international law. So and treaties and whatnot. I mean, where does it go?
It's
so you're
a bit
best to trust in yourself.
Yeah, it's a bit unpredictable at the moment, right? So unpredictability in itself is a risk. So
Absolutely, yeah,
I completely agree.
Yeah, no, fascinating.
Well, thank you guys. That's all the time that we have for today. I'm sorry. I think we could go on for hours.
Yeah, no, definitely. No, it's great. Yeah.
But thank you so much for coming. And if you have any more questions, please leave the questions in the comments, and we'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.